All right, so ambitiously, I'm going to try to do 3 sessions tonight. Well, at least do two, but I think we can do three. Just because I want to group them together because it has to do with law. Some of this stuff is going to be so basic, you're going to be like, duh. And then other things, controversial. And some of those things will be mixed in. And so that's, we'll see that. So let's start this with very practical, I'm sure you've heard this before. You may have said this before. Hopefully not recently. No condemnation. And that is, you can't legislate morality. Okay. If what you mean is that the law does not change the human heart, that civil law especially doesn't produce sunshine and free ponies. Okay, I agree with that. Okay, if that's what you mean. I suspect that's what a lot of people don't mean. A lot of people do mean that. Some people, I think, especially if they are college professors, journalists, moral philosophers, and I say that very loosely in this case, because what they're trying to do is divorce the law of a people from the morality of a people, or the concept altogether, to prevent you from looking at what we're going to look at. The title of the second session is going to be The Law Above the Law. And my picture behind me that I did beforehand, a little artwork, always do it beforehand, and that way you're not wasting as much time drawing during the class. But they're trying to prohibit you from going outside of the public square. And this is part of what's behind barring religious presuppositions from the public square. But we'll come back to that. So what is law? What is law in the most basic sense? And here is going to be the basic stuff. Let me give you 3 R's. First, law is rational. Law is rational. It presupposes mind, volition, accountability, intellectual stuff, and rational stuff that makes for accountability. And so right away you're going to have a problem from a materialistic perspective accounting for law. And you'll have a problem from a Christian perspective dealing with law as the materialists do. One of the things we'll talk about again, and I've said it many times already, natural law. Well, tonight's the night, because I've been saying, I know we haven't got to that yet, but I had to borrow from it, because we do that all the time. But natural law is misunderstood, even in Reformed circles. Sometimes, especially in Reformed circles. Certainly it was by Karl Barth and in Van Tillian land. And one of the main mistakes that is made, and it'll even reach back into David Hume, which I didn't think we were into quoting him favorably, but the idea of what's called the naturalistic fallacy. But one of the things you want to see about law being rational is that we're not actually talking about descriptive law here, which is rational if I'm a scientist and I'm looking at the law of gravity or whatever else. That's rational, but it's descriptive. We're not going to mean law in a descriptive sense, like the law of gravity. Now, that's going to be relevant later on, a descriptive sense. We'll talk about laws of diminishing returns in economics. We'll talk about laws of unintended consequences in all kinds of social policy. There's even Paul's, in Romans 7, the law waging war in my members. There's a law of sin and death and so on. And that's all great, but that's descriptive. When we use the word law in that sense, we mean something like a principle. That's what we mean there. We're going to use law to mean either a command or an obligation. In other words, normative rather than descriptive. And having said that, we're going to reject David Hume's treatment of what's called the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy, if you've ever heard of that. And I say Hume, but others down to our day that seem to think that this natural law constitutes, that fallacy constitutes some kind of defeater for natural law theory. Now, what is it? Now, it's the idea. This is the second straight week I've done this, but here I've got my markers at least. I just keep doing that. And it's supposed to be a nice mug, too, so I can, because I'll just knock this over. So I'm going to grab out a couple right now. But the naturalistic fallacy, what is that? Briefly. I've wasted all this time, I'm not going to put it. But is and ought. Those are the two words. Where do I want to put this? Really, I could put is anywhere, because everything here has a nature. I could describe it. Such and such is such and such. Let's put it over here. This is what we're talking about, natural law. Is versus, I didn't give myself enough room. Ought. The naturalistic fallacy is that you can't derive an ought from an is. Well, fallacy is if you try to do it. And so a lot of people, when they hear natural law, there's several things they hear. One of the things they could hear is the what's called the jus gentium, the justice of the nations, or the laws of the nations. Okay, that's part of it. But we're not asking, the reason we read Cicero is not because we're saying, come on, Greeks, would you tell us how to do this? Because it worked so well for you. Now, sometimes we learn from their mistakes. But even though that's part of the study of natural law, it's not what we mean. We also don't mean like the law of the jungle. In other words, much like presuppositionalists do with natural theology, they make the same mistake with natural law. They reach back into Hume's distinction here, and they think what we're saying is the way nature does it. Meaning down here, physical things, or the pagans. In other words, autonomous reasoning, all that good stuff. That's not, nor has it ever been, what natural law means in the Christian tradition. Okay? What we mean is not nature in the sense of physicality. It has implications for physicality. So cats are four-legged beings is part of natural law, and cats are physical things. But the formal relationship there is not itself physical. We mean moral principle here, when we're talking about it here, moral principles and the divine attributes upon which they are based. Divine attributes are also natures. Loosely speaking, God is simple, not made of parts. But when we speak about that, we are speaking of attributes of God and ideas in the mind of God, and everything that is because of what it says about God. And so that's what we mean by natural law. Okay? Moral principles and the divine attributes upon which they are based are realities with nature, and they're communicated to what? How do we get them? Through reason. It is this moral nature of God himself expressed in the image of God. And I am skipping forward, but we'll talk about natural law in more detail later. But all I want to say right now is that this law is rational. We can't talk about laws that are not just irrational. I don't think anybody would want to claim an irrational law, but some may want to think that is irrational. Okay, we'll come back to this when we talk about natural law. But I'm setting up Thomas Aquinas' first definition of law. And this is part duh and part controversial. So, or at least if you don't know what he's talking about. Aquinas says, and this is in the Summa Theologica, this is part 2, in his section on law, it's question 90. And he says, law is a rule and measure of acts by which man is induced to act or is restrained from acting. For lex, that's the Latin word, law, is derived from legare. That's the infinitive of the same to bind. To bind. That doesn't sound very rational. Well, but if God is commanding you of something in your mind, you are bound. So even if I don't understand it, I'm bound to do what he says. Yes, however, that doesn't mean he's not appealing to your mind. He is. In fact, the more you get why he's saying do this and don't do that, the more his law is not burdensome, as John says, because you see the rationale of it and you obey better when you love what you see in the reason for the command, for the moral obligation. Sorry, Aquinas continues, because it obliges. And he throws another Latin word at you from the same word, obligare. It obliges one to act. Okay, so that's Aquinas' first definition. It's rational, and in that reason, it binds you. So reason is that measure of what's right and wrong, and only reason directs toward moral ends. But Thomas has to build that up with some other attributes. He gives a final, more specific definition in question 90 of the Summa. In part 2, he says, law is, and this is a little wordy. Again, this is what I meant by the part de and the part huh. So here it is. Law is an ordinance of reason for the common good. Communist. No, wait, hold on. Just wait. I love doing that. For the common good made by him who has care of the community. Mao? Just wait for it. Just wait for it. Who has care of the community and promulgated, sent out, decreed. Okay? So, 3-part definition. And you can only really get at what he's getting at when he fields objections to it, which make up the next few articles of that question. Okay? So the first one, common good. We already established its reason, okay? But common good. Well, it's objected that all commands, all human actions, all reasons are directed toward individual goods, particular matters, private ends. So Aquinas wants to argue against that, push back and say, no, there's still a common thing that we all have in common. Ayn Rand should have paid attention to this when she was in the tradition of Aristotle or Aquinas, she thought, in her particular brand of objectivism, that the organism, the individual, acts toward ends, and there's nothing higher than that in that sense. Well, if that's true, then it's a self-contradictory concept, okay? Because, first of all, how do you know what kind of a pleasure-seeking being you are? Anyway, that's a rabbit trail. But in citing Aristotle on the higher end of happiness, all in the species have the same thing. All of us are directed toward happiness, which means that happiness is a thing with nature. And therefore it is the same for all. Oh, so you're going to decide what I do? Wait for it. But no, but God did. He designed you for a particular end, and that end is the same in general, for all rational pleasure seekers, okay? All laws respecting those individual, particular, or private ends are species of what all share in common. And so an individual's pursuit of happiness, to use that Jefferson phrase, we touched on it last time, an individual's pursuit of happiness as a right is something that everyone shares in common with everyone else. Oh, so we all have to do it the same way? See, just wait for it. You know? And I argue with myself a lot, but I know you libertarians out there. I know what you're thinking. Anyway, but against this reason, against the second one, I am going to defend that because Thomas did. That was the second objection. How is not just reasonable, but him who has care of the community? What's that all about? Why is a reason? Well, first of all, God's reason is the ultimate mover on all of this. But why does that reason have to be in an office? It is objected, Thomas fields this objection, that both the Apostle Paul and the philosopher, that's Aristotle, they make all men competent to apply this reason. And that, another objection says, fathers are sufficient for households. Aquinas replies that while making law belongs naturally to the whole people, and we already proved that, and we agree from Rutherford, from Bastiat, we saw that last time, but while we have this by nature in ourselves, the right to make law, before government ever came around, there is, Aquinas says, civilly, a public personage, a representative. Okay, so as to virtuous action, Aquinas argues, no one can compel the conscience of another. But force comes in when virtue does not, or the way we say it to our kids, if you don't control yourself, somebody's going to do it for you. So there's self-control or self-government, and when that breaks down, somebody's got to do it. Libertarian again says, who gets to decide that? Have you been watching the same game we have since the Garden of Eden? It's a madhouse. Okay? Starting to see some differences between libertarianism and conservatism here in the Christian doctrine of sin, which we will get to in more detail. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm not beating on you libertarians. I'm just giving you some stuff to think about. Um, but in answer to the last objection, that third one, we see that Thomas's reliance on Aristotle, I'm going to make a criticism here, was amiss, since the state is referred to as the perfect community. So you have those households, you do have self-control, that's yours by nature, but then the state is a perfect community toward which the home is driven. And you see that in Aristotle's Politics. There's an eschatological truth there, okay? But neither Aristotle nor Thomas in following him considered the extent to which the Antichrist state, where you saw that with the beast in Revelation 13 borrowing from Daniel's language. But this is just the Christian doctrine of sin. They didn't consider how that would oppose the natural design of the home. And a principle that we'll talk about later on, when more people own something, the less they own that thing. Okay? We'll come back to that. But Paul's sense of the patria, the families of the earth in Ephesians 3:14 and 15 would be a better reference point. Yes, the home does grow and self-government does grow in that sense. But that we'll have to come back to that. And then Thomas's third part that he has to defend, that promulgation part. So it's rational, it's for the common good, by him who has care of the community, and promulgated. It's objected there that natural law, and even you could even say divine law, is fixed. It's based on eternal law. It's based in God. So the essence of the law, God is the lawgiver, and he doesn't have to give laws to himself. So why are we even talking about it like that? That's basically the objection. But God is a lawgiver. This is Aquinas' response, basically, above nature, above natural law, and it is he who commands through that law. Okay, so just remember that when we get to natural law, it's the nature of moral objects decreed by God to speak of his moral perfections. Okay, so even when we talk about natural law, you might think of that, in deist ways. And I think it's the way that a lot of Reformed people are hearing it too, in addition to pagan, that it's deistic. In other words, when I think of natural law, what I think of is all the stuff the deists meant in how God communicated. So it's fixed and things like that. Well, even if that were true, that's still speech from God. It's not true. But in nature, that which is fixed is first commanded. It's commanded by God, but it's not just voluntary, theological voluntarism, which he can command whatever he wants because he's God. He commands according to his nature, which is whatever he wants. Don't fall for that Euthyphro dilemma as a Christian, because those two things go together. All of that is to say, that's my biggest argument, that law is reason. That's my first R. The other R's are super quick. But law is reason. Second R word, law is right. All laws are right. Stop it. Law is right. The character of it, its end, and its whole quality is righteousness. That presupposes the rightness of law, which everybody's shooting for, if they're in the law business, except for lawyers. But law is right, and that presupposes a transcendent way things ought to be. And so this becomes a help in apologetics, in moral philosophy. What counts as a sufficient cause for moral ends, for moral standards among men? If you want to drive religion out of the public square, you drive, what kind of a morality do you drive out of the public square? Everything that's needed to be a sufficient end cause to get that moral motion going. Law is legislated morality. How fast do you drive in your car? Speed limits, that's not a moral issue. Why do you have the speed limit that you have? Oh, I don't think there should be any speed limit because I'm a libertarian, so I don't think about it like that. Why not? Because I oughta? Did you say oughta? Where'd you get that oughta from? Okay, so it's always a moral issue every time. We'll drive home that point more as we go. Third R, law is restraint. Law is restraint. And that presupposes sin too. We're going to talk about a lot of things tonight that presuppose sin. Which means that if you don't have sin as part of your political theory, you need to go and get yourself a bigger political theory, a more objective political theory. Law in this world assumes sin. Paul says in 1 Timothy 1:10, the law is not laid down for the just, but for the unjust. Why am I commanding you something? Because you're bad at it. In this world, now that doesn't, I know there's more to the law than that. I understand that. But in this world with civil law with a sword, I mean, it's a sword. It's not like a, like an Etch-a-Sketch or some kind of a, anyway. There's a lot of jokes that can go there, but I didn't think about it. But it is a sword. Let's put it that way. It's a fence to sin. It's not a seed to virtue. That doesn't mean that it doesn't encourage in any way virtue. Because I know 1 Peter 2:14. You're not just punishing the bad, but you're promoting the good. I understand that. But the law does not produce life. Okay? The logic of sin and civil law goes a little something like this. If law is for restraining sin, and if all men are sinners, well, then it follows that law is for restraining both all citizens and all magistrates. I don't know how many times perfectly unsilly people, grown adults, will say things like, but why would he do something like that? Because he's a devil in human form. What kind of a question is that? I thought you believed in total depravity. But it's on the news. They wouldn't lie. My goodness. The Christian doctrine of sin. When they go into the public sphere, they don't jump into the Superman booth and come out with non-sinner. Okay, so this is applying it consistently to the civil sphere. Bastia, give us some help here on the law as a negative. Now, this is going to be a battle, and this will be more in the third section, but I'll introduce it here. Law as a negative concept. Now, I'm cheating because I'm giving you my side. I'm not giving you the other, but I will in the third session, so just wait for it. He talks about law as a negative concept. Given the world of sin, given evil, he says, quote, the purpose of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, he says, it is injustice instead of justice that has an existence of its own. He doesn't mean what you think he means. He doesn't mean it has this kind of existence of it. He means it's the default down here. Injustice is the default down here, not justice. Bastiat said, justice is achieved only when injustice is absent. So what are we shooting for here in this whole thing called government? Pretty low. Pay attention to that when you hear accusations that you're making your politics an idolatry. That's a good warning. But I would like to suggest to you very strongly that one of the major tests for whether or not your political theory is idolatrous is whether or not you think that government should deliver to you things that only God was meant to give to you. Who's got the idol now? That's got to be a core criteria for whether or not you think law is supposed to produce rainbow and cotton candy and free ponies. Or whether or not it's just supposed to stop bad things from happening. It's so depressing. You mean like the Bible? At that point, between Genesis 3 and Revelation 21, yeah, there's a lot of low points. Because that's about what we're up to. The accumulation of power. Your doctrine of sin has to be a fundamental object of sound political theory. If the accumulation of power is a fundamental object of political science, which it is, and all non-Christian political theorists would agree with that, but premise 2, if sin has an eye toward power, which it does, then any political theory that does not keep its eye on the sin nature will be a very, very shallow, naive theory. It'll be constantly taken by surprise that men are up to no good. Law cannot tackle sin in any meaningful way if its mechanisms in government are not structured with restraining sin in mind. People are always complaining, our justice system is broken. But is your justice system built to restrain sin in the first place? Not to eradicate sin, but to restrain sin. Final application of the Christian doctrine of sin is how it shapes the whole of one's vision of justice, which we'll go more in detail in the third session. But Thomas Sowell has called this a battle of what he calls the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. I'm supposed to have props, and I'll get that prop after. I'll do it in the second session. But his book, The Conflict of Visions, in this case, is a good one to get there. But it's clear enough which he means, who applies to who here, the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision of politics. But how does sin affect the whole of one's public philosophy? Well, it does so in both what Sowell calls the moral and the mental natures, namely of the planners and the people as a whole. What your view of their moral and mental natures are, what it assumes in the theory about the theorist, the planner, and by all who are implementing the vision. What are they capable of? What is human nature, in other words? That will totally shape your view of law and justice. I mention this in the context of law and justice because of how realistic or unrealistic one is about the difference. Now, we're going to plug in the 10th commandment here about coveting, and think about what coveting is for a second. How realistic or unrealistic your view is about the difference, the chasm between the fixed nature of things and the ideal vision of things. How wide that chasm is going to radically affect one's definition of law and especially of justice to begin with. And I contend that that is a sin issue. That's why I just mentioned the 10th commandment. What do I mean by that? The wider that gap is between the divinely ordained order and the expectation for temporal change and how much that gets you going, the greater one's discontent is with both the design and the designer. Utopianism, I've heard it called political messianism in a book that was written, J.L. Talman, I think, in the 1880s. The wider that gap is for you, the more you're breaking the 10th commandment. And here I don't mean an individual eyeing somebody's property. We talked about that. I'm talking about the planner, the innovator, the dreamer, the envisioner, with what you want to shake God's world like a piñata, and how much candy you think you're going to beat out of the image of God to get it. That's a sin issue in which covetousness leads to murder and every other violation of the image of God. So that's session 1. We'll come back for session 2 in just a little bit.